recruit would flourish in a place like Oxford because, especially in the 1920s, the First World War has happened, 1 million British soldiers have died. So the world of 1920s Oxford, or late 1910s Oxford, was a very different world from the world of the sort of end of the British Empire, the heyday of the British Empire in the 19th century. So it was probably a more contemplative world, and also very, very much removed from the horrors of what had been going on at the front. It was a place where people like Tolkien and Lewis could, in a sense, indulge their passions, indulge their interests, away from any kind of the glare of any form of publicity. Oxford is, and always has been, known as an ivory tower, a place where you can live away from the real world. And obviously people writing fantasy literature and interested in Anglo-Saxon and the higher points of philosophy and mathematics and so on are studying in beautiful libraries for hours on end. Their imaginations can be indulged in the kind of way they wouldn't perhaps in a busy city like London, where they're going on a tube to get to work. Here in Oxford they would just be walking through a quadrangle, sitting themselves in a library, immersed in a world that was very far removed from the horrors of the First World War and the horrors, the reaction that people suffered hugely from, and the reaction to that war, which affected the whole of the country for a long, long time. So Oxford gives them a sort of haven. Plus, of course, the people like Tolkien's fascination with Anglo-Saxon. He's surrounded by loads of books written in Anglo-Saxon. He's got Welsh books, he's got a huge number of different language books that he can play around with and see on his doorstep. Wonderful, wonderful resources for a man who's interested in immersing himself in other worlds. Of course, the history of Oxford is the story of religious, the history of theology and religious buffeting throughout the centuries. So Oxford is an incredibly important place for that kind of discussion and that kind of interest. If you think that most of those colleges were founded under Roman Catholic institutions and became Protestant, and that of course the dons had to be ordained until the mid-19th century. Dons had to be ordained members of the Anglican Church in order to work there. So it's Oxford and the Oxford movement with John J.H. Newman and the revival of the interest in Catholicism makes the Inklings, or C.S. Lewis in particular, and Tolkien, the fact that they're working and living in Oxford is crucially important, I'm sure. They're surrounded by theological debate of the highest order. And of course they're living in a century they're working and living in Oxford in that time between the First and the Second World Wars. So it was an extraordinary time to be there. It's quite an interesting thing when you hear this is what C.S. Lewis gave the University Sermon, which is the annual sermon in St Mary's Church, in the University Church in Oxford. And he's called it his Weight of Glory sermon. And this is what he said: "There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendours." Those kinds of words really do, don't they, evoke an attitude which is far beyond just the sort of basics of theology. You can just see how he creates those marvellous stories, because he's thinking in far greater terms than just whether you believe in transubstantiation or not, or whether Pope or whether clerics should wear robes or whatever. He's far, far more interested in those esoteric but fundamental aspects of being a human being.